One.
Hey, fellow G&Ters, those of us who like our spirituality with a twist. So we are doing a very, very G&T thing. We are trying to do these education projects at time. That's part of our mission statement. And we're doing a deep dive into understanding Christianity and really Christianity and sort of its history. And this little project is related to one of our other things we have going on, which is our version of Project 2025, America, what the hell? Because America has become this chaotic, quasi-authoritarian place, or whatever terminology one wants to use. And part of what we've been observing about this is there's a Christianity party problem as part of this. And there's this toxic version of Christianity associated with nationalism, which is at least part of the problem. So part of our way of trying to talk about this, since we like to educate on these things as much as we can, do the best we can with it, is to really talk about Christianity and maybe think about Christianity from a bigger perspective. This topic is particularly uh, related to what we're going to be trying to do today, which is talking about this group of early Christians, which are called the Proto Orthodox, the people that will become the Orthodox Christians, and probably the people who are most directly kind of the forerunners of like the more authoritarian types of Christianity. But before we get into the deep parts of our project, if you could do all the things that people always ask you to do, like subscribe, write a review, send an episode on to someone else. As Daniel always says, this is a labor of love for us, and we love doing what we're doing. And any support you can give would obviously always be appreciated. Thank you so much. But otherwise, we're into it. Anything you want to say before we go digging in deeper?
No, we're good.
I had two minor caveats. The first thing is that we've been trying to make the point that we're not trying to say anyway that all Christianities are bad. There are people who do that kind of thing, and that is not what we're trying to do,
Right.
right? And then the other part is when you say Christianities, it's funny because I wrote it in my notes, Christianities, and the spell checker put like multiple red lines under it, like that word doesn't exist, you know.
Hmm.
But that is the right word because, as we talked about in our previous episode, if you want to go and check it out, we did a couple of the early branches of Christianity. This group called the Ebionites, this group called the Marcionites. And that's the right way to talk about it. There are these like different categories. And if you don't know about this, this is like probably not just a fascinating history to understand, but in terms of spirituality and probably even in terms of like trying to understand culture and the culture in the world that we live in, like just to see this is like, I think, a pretty powerful project. So, okay. Well, I guess we're going to talk about the other thing I wanted to say about this, Daniel, is the fact that there are these multiple Christianities. I suppose you could feel different ways about that. I think I was listening to one of the people who I was doing the backstory research with this, and he has this idea that, Christianity will fall apart if you sort of realize how unstable its history is. But I don't want to look at it that way. My sense of this is more that it's kind of a freeing thing in a way, or can be seen that way, that it gives you more freedom to choose whatever version of Christianity that you can relate to personally, because there's lots of options then on the table. So I don't know, do you agree with that in principle?
Yeah, I think if you want to look at it in that way.
I mean, you might have to face the fact that there's no definitive real Jesus or real Christianity, but it does. And I mean, obviously, that depends on your view. That can be painful in some ways. But
Well,
like it
even
does open up the idea that you can choose a different spiritual adventure for yourself, right? Because there's
well,
other
even
options
if
on the
there
table.
even if there is a historical Christ, there is not one particular view of him.
Mhm.
Obviously not, as can be seen in the New Testament. There's, multiple apostles who write multiple stories about him, all from different angles.
Yes.
So I think, on one hand, you can certainly have a debate on if there was a historical person. I tend to think that there was, but it's less sort of important because his words haven't really, haven't survived intact. They are memories, interpretations, you know, and that's what's survived intact. And so we're sort of getting a story of a story. And whenever you have that, regardless of whatever it is that you are talking about, whether it be a historical figure or something that happened the other week, you know, you're getting only one perspective. And then to take that singular perspective as if it's the only perspective, and then to kind of dunk on other people who might have different perspectives, it's just being, like logically fallible, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I kind of like to think of it as like different spiritual paths emerging out of either a real person or some kind of spiritual figure, however you want to think about that, you
Right.
know, but different paths emerge out of that framework. And then people take that in different directions. And now that goes down to our present day or something, right?
Yeah.
But like, again, the other side of that is this idea that, if the arguing over who's the real Jesus and who's the real Christians, like, I don't, this has to stop at some time in humanity, right? Otherwise, we're just going to go around these same fucking things like forever, like
That's
this
what's going to
has to
happen.
end at some point.
That's what's going
And
to happen though.
it's a delusion, like
That's
in the true Buddhist sense, this is delusion,
But even
you know?
in Buddhism, Eric, there's different schools, you know? There's
But you don't
different
have to like fight to the death about it. That's the big difference, I think.
you don't have to fight to the death, but in traditions there's any tradition, any religion, any whatever, there's always going to be some kind of purity sort of test.
Mhm.
And that's one. And then the other one is I don't know, maybe the battle for people's attention, much like how I always say that the world is after your attention now, even watching this podcast, you know?
Yeah.
And so in the drive to garner people's attention, you have to delineate yourself between the other viewpoints that are very close to yours, by the way. So you're going to have to really highlight the differences and then drive the wedges in between those to show that you are the right one. People should follow you and they should donate to your cause and they should bring their friends to your congregation and they should show up to your things over and over again because you're the right one and not the other ones. It's almost inherent in the battle for following.
Yeah, I know this is really kind of leads into like what we'll be talking about today, this proto orthodox question.
All right.
I think when I think about like a nodal figure, like whether there was a Jesus or not a Jesus, obviously this creates a whole flourishing of spiritual paths. Whether it was a
Mm.
Buddha or not a Buddha, there's this whole explosion of spiritual paths. And I think what you're saying is true. The way like a Tibetan Buddhist tantric person thinks is way different than like a Thailand, monk, right, who's in
Right.
the Theravada tradition. They're not thinking the same thing. That I
Not
think
at
it's the
all.
conflict, though. You have to get out of this conflict of the
Sure.
fight over what's the real this or the real that. Until we get out of that, I know what you mean. It feels like we're in a doom spiral, like this will never end. I hear what you're saying, but like if you want to get to the spirituality of this from that point of view, it's delusion and it has to break at some point, hopefully, right?
But that's it. I mean, we want to get to the spirituality of it.
Yeah,
I
true.
don't think that like most people do. I don't think so. I know we've been having this conversation off podcast, but we'll bring it on here. And we do talk about it on occasion. But this way of thinking, this way of being, the Taoist way, the tantric way, it's different. I'm not saying it's better because that would be being logically fallible, right? Which I just said is right, not what we want to do. But it's different and it is not for everyone. And you have to kind of hold some things that are outside of the confines of society's norms very close to yourself so that you can, see outside the box a little bit. Because what you're talking about is not only, I was going to say merely, but not only a matter of division within a particular viewpoint, but it's division within one's own mind. It's division between one person and another. It's division between one group and another group. It's division between that one nation and another nation. It's duality. This is the point. This is yoga. This is the yin yang, or as the people call it here, yin and yang. It's the masculine and feminine. This is two sides of the same coin, but you cannot have the coin without either side. And so, as we look to sort of use wisdom to transcend artificial barriers, I don't think people are looking to do that. I really do feel like that brings people together and removes division intentionally, obviously, but that makes it less powerful in a sense because it moves the power away from the institution and puts the power in the person. But if you have empowered people, they don't need the institution anymore. There's no real like drive to go to it because you're your own battery, and now it's my choice to show up. And of course, somebody could argue and say, oh, well, it was always their choice to show up. Yes and no. If you're, at least in my opinion, you're an independent practitioner of any tradition, it doesn't matter, or religion, or whatever, or artist or something, you know, the necessity that you have to seek guidance on a regular basis is not as high. I'm not saying that those people are better. And of course, we need community and things like this. It's a very important piece of human existence. But you can find your own answers if you search for them and if you know how. And that makes seeking outside answers from other people who are going to do the same thing that you can do much less important to you. And that's damaging to the structures, to the power
Yeah, I mean,
structures.
it's obviously like it undermines authority, and this is like perfect for like talking about the proto-orthodox.
Sure.
The other part about that for me is if you want to talk about better, um, and I know we have this thing where we don't want to say, well, Taoism is better than Sufism or blah blah. Like we don't want to go
Right.
down those roads because that
No.
never ends, right?
Yeah.
And that's really like that's just wrong at the core. But the only thing I would say, and this again goes to this discussion of this group that we'll get to the proto-orthodox, the way things can be better is you can leave space and freedom to allow different people to find their way. And that's, I think, where you can say one thing gets better than another. If your concept is, I'm not going to leave other beings the space to find their way, I'm going to like impose my vision upon these other
Right.
beings that don't share it. Well, then you can say, well, that's not better, that's worse.
Right.
And that gets right into the heart of this question. So, okay, we'll do our little history on like what we're calling what is called by scholars of the field. We'll try to share what we know about this idea called the proto-orthodox. So, where does this language come from? So, proto meaning like before the orthodox, and the orthodox becomes the name for the group that sort of wins out in the end in the whole story of early Christianity, which we will try to share. Orthodox, the terminology is interesting because orthodox means like right view. So it's the people who feel like they have the right view, which already should ring some alarm bells, you know, if you're going to say we are the right view people. And then what this group does, just to finish the language of it, is they end up going after the heretics, what
Oh, yeah.
the the heresy people. And you know, like there's this term, if you've never heard of it, called heresiologists,
Oh,
people whose specialty it was to go after heretics. So this is where this whole thing kind of comes out of. That word is so interesting based on what you were saying earlier, Daniel, because I jotted it down in my notes for this. That word heresy actually comes from a word apparently that means choice.
mm,
So the idea was you had a choice and you made the wrong one, therefore you're a heretic because you have the wrong view. But like linguistically, that was so interesting to me, especially listening to what you were saying earlier, because basically what it means linguistically speaking, that you're going after the option of choice and you're going to hunt down and destroy choice. And I
yes.
think for everything we do here, there's no
No.
spirituality if you hunt down choice and you kill choice. So, anyways, it's very telling language, I guess, if you know, like when you really kind of dig it apart,
Mm,
kind of wild and really fits into what you were saying earlier. Yeah.
mm.
Okay. So, who are these proto Orthodox folks? Well, I think a lot of the standard beliefs that we would recognize now as being Christianity kind of find their root back to these folks. So if you went through a list, it would be like the divinity of Jesus. Again, we've seen groups of people like the Ebionites who didn't believe Jesus was a divine person. He was just a prophet who was like extending the teachings that were before him, but they didn't necessarily see him as more than a human. Um, the idea of the Trinity, which we'll get to eventually talk about a little bit. They're supporters of the four Gospels, so they put the New Testament together in its final structure. Definitely, as you were talking about earlier, Daniel, the authority of the church, and you have to trace that back to Peter initially, right? I was raised Catholic. You know, we were both Catholic kids, right? So that was the big deal. The Holy Roman Apostolic Church centered in Rome. I think I said that every week in my
Mm.
youth, right? When I would do the creeds. And so, you know, that whole thing. And it was interesting for me, like thinking about this group, because I was trying to like, I was talking with some people about these episodes. I was going, what did I think when I was Catholic? You know, I was out with my son over the weekend watching some football games. Daniel and I were talking about that before. And we were watching the San Francisco 49ers play the Seattle Seahawks, which, if you paid any attention to football at all, was a complete ass kicking. So there was nothing to watch. And then my son was asking me about like what I believed when I was a kid about these religious things. Like he's interested now. He's 13 years old. He's asking these questions. And I was like, that's an interesting thing. What did I think? You know? But obviously, I was raised in this sort of what you would call orthodox, coming out of this proto-orthodox tradition. And it's kind of interesting to think what you actually think about that. I guess I
Hmm.
believed in some sacraments and I believed a lot of these things, but it's hard to remember back. And my son was asking me tough questions like, well, did you really believe in it? And then he was asking me, well, did you really reject it? So he's asking me the tough questions, which I guess we all have to face as we go through a conversation like this one.
Hmm.
Ultimately, the understanding of Jesus here is that his death is a sacrifice for sin. That's the proto Orthodox people, too. Not everybody thinks that way. And we'll have other visions of people who don't think that way. It's not obvious the Marcionites don't think that way. And we talked about that group last week, right? They see
Hmm.
Jesus more as like, again, like an avatar type figure who is bringing a message of salvation. The fact that he was crucified is like the reactions of the powers that be, but wasn't quintessential to what the teaching was. So, it's all over the place. So, but the things that we would think of as being predominant. Also, the last piece I guess I would add to this, and maybe if you want to talk about Paul, St. Paul related to this, but the rejection of the Jewish law, right, in some way or another as part of this tradition too. Though I
Mm.
think if we trace this down to us now, like sort of like what you might call the cherry picking of the law, right? We choose the parts that we want and we kind of a lot of times bash other people with them.
Hmm.
That's a terrible problem. So, anyways, how does this happen? Is the next part. Do you have anything like you want to add to that, Daniel, before I
No,
we just
how
go
does
into
what happen?
well, how did this like situation develop? So
Mm.
I was doing some research around this. I wanted to share like the best historical perspective I could on this. And basically what it was there were sort of like these different Christianities we've been talking about all kind of like coexisted.
Hmm.
And they appear like very early. It's a strange story. It's hard to know totally what it means. But in different parts of like the Roman Empire, all these different Christianities kind of pop up. So
Mm.
again, we were talking about, we'll eventually talk about some Gnostics. They were really big in Egypt. I guess if you
Mm.
go back and you look at like early Christianity, and we're really talking like in the first 100 and something years, 100 and whatever years, there's already these different groups that are springing up in different parts of the Roman Empire with like different ideas, radically different. And then they're kind of overlapping one another in some ways like by location, but you could tell that some of them are concentrated in some locales more than others. So the Gnostics are hanging around in Egypt. The Marcionites, who we were just talking about last episode, they have this very controversial belief about the God of the Old Testament is not the same God as the God of the New Testament, and you have to follow this other God. They're around Turkey. So there's these different groups that are in different places, and then the proto-Orthodox are like kind of centered around Rome. And when you look at it, they have sort of more power, more money, and more influence than other people because they're like in the head of the empire, right? They're just richer people, like more strong administrative stuff going on, and sort of like more money, more
Mm.
power. And
Hmm.
they're able to
Hmm.
eventually sort of put the squeeze on a lot of their opponents.
Hmm.
So that's kind of interesting. That's one side of the story, right? That you had a certain group that had a lot more, they had a leg up on the other groups and they had a lot more power, which
Yeah.
it's almost like you were talking, that's probably to be expected, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. And then the other piece of it, and I wanted to do this because, what's distinctive about especially this proto-Orthodox vision of Christianity, like is some of the things that maybe we would trace back to things that we might be still questioning to the present day. And I'm curious what you have to think about this, Daniel. But so what was it about Christianity? Like what was unique about it is another interesting question here too. And it seems like that they're, again, historians' perspective that we're trying to share. A lot of innovations happened in what Christianity was doing, especially when you get to this proto-Orthodox group. So apparently what was really unique, and I'm really curious about your opinion about this, Daniel, in the pagan world, that world was this idea of exclusivism in religion, like that didn't exist before. So if you were a pagan person, you could go to the temple for Athena, you could go to the temple for Zeus, you could go to the temple for Apollo. It was all good. There was no problem. Even if
Hmm.
you joined like kind of a mystery cult, you could be in the mystery cult, you could go hang out in the other place later on. There was no expectation, apparently, that you follow like one thing.
Mm.
So apparently, this idea, no, you follow our thing to the exclusion of all other things, in that way was like a real innovation. Like they didn't think that way back then. And I think that's kind of fascinating.
Eric, does this, I mean, you've studied the Kabbalah much more than I have, therefore your influence on, Judaic teaching, maybe not the Talmud, but at least in the Kabbalah, is this, and if you don't know, you don't know, but
Uh-huh.
is that sort of like exclusionary monotheistic ideology? That's well said. Uh, in that tradition?
I think like when I was studying the ancient history, I'll kind of try to answer, maybe I'll get to it one way or the other, right? Maybe a little roundabout, but we'll get to it. So I was interested in that question, and a lot of people that I was using as the historians for my prepping my notes for this were addressing that question. So the interesting thing about like Judaism and Jewish people at that time, whether there was even what we would call Judaism as exists now, that's kind of a question, I guess. But when we're going back to the time where these events are happening, they did have a monotheistic religion going on,
Right.
right? But they also didn't have an idea that they expected other people to convert to their religion. You could if you wanted to, but no one had the expectation of it. And when listening to historians talk about it, it wasn't even like they thought that it like obviously they felt like, well, our way is the right way for us, but there wasn't this idea so strongly, right? That there was like
Hmm.
one particular right way, or at the very least it was like, well, this is just what we're doing. And there wasn't that same sense of like tension that's going to come out of this, right? There's definitely going to be a tension that's going to eventually rise out of this. When you think about like Kabbalah, and I think we should do something on it at some point because it's
Yeah, for sure.
fascinating, right? It depends on when you think that all begins. Like people debate when like Kabbalah really becomes the Kabbalah, but there's no doubt that they were developing some of the things that we'll see, like when we talk about Gnostic stuff and other stuff, that they were developing interpretive traditions that were being a little bit more flexible in reading the scriptures. That's for sure,
Mm,
right? So they were going through and they were like looking for the symbolic meanings of things, and there was more of an openness to doing that, right? Which I guess could be challenging to other, people who are practicing Judaism, right? If you can start reading them very symbolically in these other ways.
hmm
Yeah. And that tradition kind of grows. I guess when we get to it, I'll be fascinated to talk about books like the Zohar and the Bahir and these things because they're doing very creative reads on scriptural stuff, but they'll say some little passage in the book of Kings tells you the secrets of like the whole universe. So they're
hmm
doing these very creative reads. And as far as like how they envision the divine, that's also kind of interesting too, because they kind of look at like the divine having all these different aspects that are coming out, right? So it's monotheistic, of course, but there's a kind of a wiggle room in this, in a
hmm
funny way. There's a great story where the Dalai Lama was looking to talk to other people who were in exile to figure out, like, okay, now the Tibetans are exile, what do we do about this? There's a great book written about it called The Jew and the Lotus. And so he's trying to talk to all these different Jewish leaders who can't agree with each other, as you would imagine, right? But at some point, he's talking to the guy who's the Kabbalist, who I really love, this particular Kabbalist. And the Dalai Lama realizes, like, well, you have all these different powers and all these different aspects of the divine. That's pretty close to us. And so they have this great conversation around that. I guess that's a long answer to the question. Does that get to any of the stuff that you were kind of
I mean,
probing
uh,
on?
I mean, I guess you're talking about this very, this sort of like kind of revolutionary idea that the proto-Orthodox people had
Yeah.
that, this sort of exclusionary monotheistic ideology as a prerequisite, if you will, to be part of their, whatever
Yeah, it seems like
church.
that's it. And it seems like that was just different. Like other pagans, I think were like, what? Because
Yeah.
it never occurred to them.
And I don't want to say it, but like the bastardization of paganism, you
Mhm.
know, via, basically via Christianity. I don't know who else, Catholicism, whatever,
You're talking
you
kind of
know.
like a vilifying or something like that, ultimately,
Yes,
right?
yeah,
That's what they happen.
vilification. Yeah, it's probably a
Yeah,
better word,
yeah.
right? Um, very strong, very, very strong. I mean, I knew the word pagan before I even understood the definition.
Yeah, because you know it negative, right?
because you
As
know it
opposed to
negative.
pejorative. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And the idea of like false idols and idols, idolatry,
Yeah.
not worshiping idolatry. Oh, by the way, look at that picture.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Uh-huh.
Right. You know? So yeah, just wanted to
Now
point
it's
that out.
wild because I had the same reaction. Like when you hear the word pagan and you don't know the context that just means like the religion of like ancient Rome and Greece and so on, right?
Hmm.
It means bad,
Right, yeah.
right? It just means bad. Oh, primitive and bad and probably nasty and
Yeah,
terrible
probably, yeah,
somehow.
primitive in
Yeah,
particular. Yeah.
yeah. I was like really floored by this because I didn't realize that it was so much that the contrast was so strong on this point. But Christianity, I guess, really comes up with the idea like, well, no, if you're following us, you're only following us. That's it.
Mm,
And that was like apparently really like out of tune with the rest of like the ancient world. And the other part of this, which is connected, was for a lot of people in like what we'll call the pagans in a neutral way, right?
hmm.
Greek and Romans, they, I guess Egyptians too, they were more into like what you would call practice as opposed to having a particular belief system.
Mm,
So it wasn't like you said, okay, here's our creed following Apollo. It was like, okay, what do you do to follow Apollo? We'll go through the rituals and do the things,
right.
right? And if we did that for, Venus or Aphrodite or something, that's cool
Mhm.
too. And, there's no problem there, right? It had more to do with like what you did rather than like having like, these are my beliefs. So I guess the other weird thing is emphasizing this idea of like, you have to like have this particular set of beliefs was
Mm,
also surprising for people too. And I was listening to like again one of the historians on this, and he said like a lot of intellectual pagans, not like your folks who were just practicing their everyday life religions and doing their things, but the people who were like the intellectual figures and all that. They were like, "What are you talking about? There's all kinds of paths to the divine." Like this is almost like a direct quote, and they were like
mm,
stunned. They were like, "What do you mean? You can get the divine multiple ways. What do you mean you can only do it one way?" That was like shocking to them.
hmm.
And apparently, a lot of the more, again, like intellectual pagans, spiritual pagans were like, of course you can get there multiple ways. And when I translate this forward, I kind of got in my mind listening to this, like this problem has never disappeared, right?
No.
This
Nope.
gets established and it just doesn't stop for like 2000 fucking years.
What do you mean? It
It
doesn't
won't
stop,
go
period.
away. Yeah,
Yeah,
it won't
no.
stop. And
Yeah.
again, it's kind of an innovation. The other part that's wild about this was that there weren't any evangelists before, apparently.
Hmm.
Evangelicalism is like a Christian thing to do. In the pagan world, I guess you could make a case for like, hey, we should all worship Apollo or something, right? And you make your case, but no one had to convert. So there wasn't like that same evangelical energy. It just didn't occur to people. And I didn't know that either, prepping this,
Mm,
right? Had heard a little bit, but it was really interesting to go a deeper dive into it. And I was like, oh, okay. So there wasn't like a thought of like, we'll have an evangelical movement where people are trying to convert other people.
mm,
So that really apparently didn't exist in the pagan world either, because there wasn't really any need for it, right? Because you weren't converting in
mm,
this very distinctive way. And I thought, okay, that's interesting too, to know something about. And you can kind of just feel how the energy of that builds into the same problems
mm,
that we have down to the present day. And then one of the guys, again, Bart Ehrman, who's one of the people I rely on for this material, he does a very good job of presenting like the scholarly state of the field. And he said, like, when people look at this, apparently it wasn't like how you might envision it, like a Billy Graham style meeting, and there's all these people preaching and everyone's listening in the square or something. Apparently, a lot of it was like word of mouth, where one person would tell someone, and then maybe they would convert and so on, right? So it was spreading over the years, but the like part of the reason why Christianity, I guess, had this force behind it was if you converted to Christianity, you really converted and you cut away all the pagan stuff.
mm,
And so you were kind of like taking away pagan people and they were getting pulled over to this other side. But even if I converted you to Apollo, you'd still be worshiping whoever,
whatever. Yeah.
Zeus. So there wasn't this thing of pulling people away from this one population. I guess you can look at that however you want to look at that. I suppose if you want to look at it cynically, you could, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you could just look at it like we have really, really strong beliefs and you should follow it. But like this problem seems like it just hasn't gone away because we're
Right.
still in the midst of this stuff. I found that to be kind of amazing. Going back to the episodes you brought up last week about like patriarchy, Daniel,
Mm-hmm.
the patriarchy thing was kind of part of this too in a weird way,
Mm-hmm.
because what it would be was you'd have, even in the conversion process, you'd have like these patriarchs who were the head of like a whole family, and they have all these
Correct.
people under the family. So if they switched, everyone in the family switched.
Correct.
So eventually, like, I guess what you were doing is you were converting families like through the patriarch,
Yeah.
and then the other people under that patriarch would have to flip too. So I know. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, but the
Wild.
the the thing about that though, Eric, is that like from my research, and that's, not super extensive, but enough. The people who convert the families that converted, the people at the top of the head of the family, the more wealthier individuals in the family converted in I guess in like show, right? Like
Hmm.
outwardly, but then their own practices never really changed, you know? And they sort of maintained their own practices, the mystery schools, those types of rituals. They did those things. They continued with those things. That never really stopped. Because despite what people would say, yeah, the religion spread very, quickly, if you want to call it that. I don't know what people would consider
Yeah,
quick
from
or
a
not
small
quick.
group in hundreds of years, you have millions of people in it in hundreds of
Right.
years,
So
and that's
it's
yeah.
it spread very quickly, of course, with the backing of the Roman Empire, and the backing of the patriarchy to get the entire Roman Empire behind it, really, you know?
It's kind of interesting what you're saying because some of the points in the beginning, I don't know if you like if you converted for show. Definitely after Constantine converts, I hear what you're saying. You're probably converting for show, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't
Mm-hmm.
want to run into problems with state authority. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know what it means if you convert, like, because Constantine doesn't convert until 313 or 312 or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So kind of later in the story. So I don't know those people who are converting ahead of time, but I think the patriarchy struck me what you were talking about before because, well, Grandpa converted, now we're all Christians now, I guess. So maybe Grandpa didn't
Right.
have to do it. Whether you're
Right. But
privately still worshiping ISIS or something,
I
maybe
don't even know if it was privately, because the thing is, if you're talking about, we're talking about hundreds of years between that and then like the Nicene meetings,
yeah, yeah.
to codify what the Bible is now. It's a couple hundred years. In that time, if there were not people carrying forth the traditions, the rituals of the whether you want to call it pagan or you want to call them mystery schools or whatever you want to, right, whatever, these kind of like elite cults, if you will, they would have disappeared. So they had to have been carried forth.
Well, even at the time that Constantine converts, you have a lot of pagans running around. You just have to shut them down,
Right.
right? You're going to have to squash them.
Right. And then these people who still believed in these things carried forth their beliefs and practices even in the midst of these mass conversions.
In some more clandestine way, even after Constantine converts, you're still going to have that, right?
Right, yeah, you're still going to have
Yeah.
it. And I mean, and it's prevalent. It's not that it's like a little bit off or there. I mean, there's historical data on it.
Yep.
And then, from again, just from my research, and Eric, we talked a little bit about this last time, but then, Christianity became, unfortunately, kind of a tool of suppression, you know,
Yeah, we'll
selling
get to like once
people.
you get it, like it's the religion of the state.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's sold people a dream that can never be proved, but one that, is an absolute part of subjugation, which, regardless of what school you believe in or don't believe, whether we're Proto Orthodox or Benedictines or we're Franciscans or whatever we are, I don't think that any of those people would say that their views are pro subjugation.
It's weird to know. It's weird to know. I got one last thing on this and maybe like
Yeah.
so I was looking at what were the things that were unique features of this. So the exclusivism was a unique thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
The emphasis on like it's not what you do, you have to have like a creed, you have to follow our vision, which is why
Mm-hmm.
people end up fighting so hard over who has the right vision. right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that matters, and you're still fighting over that to the present day if you want to think of it in
Mm-hmm.
that way, right? You did it through like this kind of word of mouth conversion where you were like flipping families, apparently, right? Then the other part was like heaven and hell, which I think gets a little bit to what you were talking about too, Daniel, which I wanted to bring it up because, again, like looking at the history behind this, you know, apparently in the pagan world and even in like the Jewish world at that time, no one was worried about going to hell. So it's almost like you could frame it like we invented a problem and then we're going to give you the solution to it.
Oh,
The problem is you could be tortured for infinity, and here's the solution. Our guy will solve that problem for you.
it's like a boss who comes in here. It's a real nice shop you got here. Would be real bad if something happened to it. You know what I mean? You know?
Be really sad if he had to be tortured for infinity.
Yeah. Be
That would
really
be
bad.
so. I mean, it's kind of a funny thing. And again, I didn't really understand that as well. You do this historical research, and like again, it's amazing and like very enlightening. I was raised in sort of like a combination of like Irish Catholic, Polish Catholic. There's lots of hell shit flying around there.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're hearing a lot about that, and a lot of it had to do with that. So I don't even, it's hard to imagine how that was even framed for people, but it's like, okay, now we have this savior figure who's going to save you from being tossed into hell for infinity by the God that he's a part of or is.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think that was part of like, again, when I was reading like the innovative things about that, that was an innovation too. For a lot of people back then, it was like, well, I want help with love, so I go to Venus or Aphrodite. I want to go to
Right.
war, so I talk to Mars. I'm interested in like how I'm going to handle like the crops, so I go to whoever, right? You know, and then the local deities of the city or something you're supposed to offer sacrifices to, and all this kind of stuff. And all of a sudden, you get this completely innovative thing, which is wild.
I
Yeah.
wanted to share this comment, Eric, that somebody left for us a little while ago. It said, he said, I grew up in, well, I think it's a he, I'm not sure, but somebody said, I grew up being told by churches that if I don't earn God's love, I would be the offspring of Satan.
Yeah. That's an innovation too,
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I'm interested in the question. There's whole books written on the history of Satan as a thing, so maybe we'll talk about it at some point.
Mm,
But like, Satan in the beginning was like a divinity whose job it was to like challenge God, right? It wasn't like some force for evil. And then eventually that flips too.
mm-hmm.
So it wasn't obvious. I don't know at the time. I'm a little fuzzy on that question. At the time where Jews are already into the idea of Satan as a fallen angel, I'm not sure. You know,
Mm.
but like in the book of Job, God is debating and betting with Satan.
Yeah, we've done an episode. We did a
That
couple episodes on Job a while back.
when we did the Carl Jung stuff with it.
Yeah,
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 that was
totally.
fun episodes. I'll
Yeah.
share a little bit more about it, and maybe we'll wrap it up for the week. But what's so interesting about to me then, and you brought up the Council of Nicaea,
Mm-hmm.
I guess the Bible itself was already standardized, but the debate they're having there is like about these technical points about like what does the Trinity mean? Is Jesus higher, or is God above Jesus, and Jesus is like secondary, or God and Jesus like indistinguishable? Like they're having these debates about these little technical points. And I guess once Constantine converted, he was like, okay, I'm not going to let you people run around having arguments about these technical points. I want this religion to work for me. So figure this shit out. But it does illustrate I think one of the things that's wild about like who has the right creed? Who's the right one? Who has the right vision of Jesus? Who is the real one? Who is the right one? And this argument, if you go back to that, you're talking like 1700 years of arguing about this,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And like we're still arguing in the present day.
Yes.
Wild. I'll share one more thing about this, uh, because, and I'll get your opinion on it as we're getting to the end. Unless you want to save it for next time. You want to save it for next time?
Well, I was only going to say that like that the Nicene Council, the debates that were going there, again from the I'm reading things from a historical perspective, not pro-religious historical perspective. right?
Yeah, agreed. We're both doing that, really.
Yeah, so it's just it's information, it probably more agnostic, really, if anything, because they're historians, you know.
Yep.
And one of the points that somebody made is that from their perspective, the that Trinity was framed in the way that it was as to be not fully understandable, and that in the tradition, at least in the way that they understood it, debate was not ex I'm not going to say not accepted, but was definitely not part of the tradition. Whereas in Judaism, for sure, debate is a big part of it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like yeah, debate. Let's talk. Let's have it out, you know? And so you used rationale and logic in order to drive points home to quell the mind. But in here, intentionally, it was done as illogical, A, which, and maybe there's reason for that. Who knows? I wasn't there. But that if you questioned it, then you were looked at as a heretic,
Yeah.
right? And that itself kind of makes you feel, even at least in my interpretation, more separate from that which you believe because you are not able to question the thing, which is, why one of the pieces of Buddhism that I like so much is that it's like, yeah, no question, please do. Like it's actually it's up to you to question. It's part of the tradition. The discussions are part of the tradition. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
to not have that and to have it intentionally be quelled, it just, in my opinion, it just seems something that you want to distribute to a mass population that is not going to question. But inherently, I feel like human beings are curious creatures and should question things. And then once they come to the answers that are deep within them, that have been run through the ringer quite a bit, they'll hold on to that beyond just this life. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's a wild question because, like, at Nicaea, and we're talking about after Constantine converts, there's this famous Council of Nicaea, and there's like one major question that they're debating, which is this really weird esoteric point of
Yeah.
like, is God the Father higher and Jesus is sort of like a little bit lower and the Holy Spirit, so whether it's a little bit hierarchical or whether or not somehow this mystery of the Trinity thing is the right way. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe people believed that like that answer mattered. I mean, I think they were probably debating that for a long time before
Sure.
that, if I understand the history. But it is weird because you come up with the mystery of the Trinity in the end. And I guess the idea is it's supposed to be beyond explanation or something,
Of
right?
course.
But then the weird part, and I think we agree on this, and it's come up on episodes where we've been trying to talk about this, where all of a sudden now you end up with this thing which is a complete mind scrambler. Like there's no way to understand it. And any way you understand it will probably turn you into a heretic
Hmm.
if you try to make sense of it. So if you try to make sense of it, heretic. And then the history becomes kind of bizarre as to the extent that I understand it. Then, because then for you do this, and then for hundreds of years afterwards, you're just pronouncing different people still heretics. It's a wild situation to find that that's the end of it. Yeah, I agree. And I wonder what that means down to the present day. I've had the thought about this that if the whole thing is like, in a certain sense, like unintelligible, right?
Mm.
You could say the positive side is we make it a mystery, but the negative side is you make it like completely unintelligible. Like
Yeah,
it's like
yeah,
it's
undigestible.
it's uncrackable.
Mm-hmm.
Your rational mind can't do anything with it.
Mm-hmm.
It might as well be like trying to digest a stone or something.
Mm-hmm.
It's like there's nothing you can do with it. That I don't know what that does to people who are, I'll say it in the more strong way, under the thrall of this kind of thinking, because then you're so vulnerable to irrationality. Maybe that ends up being true because you squash the rational part of the person.
Yeah.
And then when
I
you have
mean,
people who are trying to exercise power over you, you just can't see and think straight, right?
right. And so I think, we can, if someone's going to make the counter argument, they'll say, well, you want to be, religion or spirituality or however you want to call it, this kind of faith, let's call it faith, should be out of your head and more in your heart. And so making something that is not logical moves you into less of a conceptualized space and more of an abstract feeling kind of space. That's fine. I can accept that as an answer. However, to your exact point, what does that do for those who are handing that to you while they're also taking from you at the same time? Because you have disarmed your discernment feature to say, oh, wait, you don't understand this either. You know what I mean? And now I'm here getting information from you when you simultaneously you're taking from me. And by the way, all the people who are here in this congregation, none of us can question because we're all supposed to be feeling. This creates sheep intentionally. And that doesn't, that doesn't sit right with me. It hasn't since I was a child.
Yeah, there's something fishy about it. And then like when you get to the kind of socio-cultural problems we're having now, well, then you could see how you get a bunch of people who can be having to turn off their rationality and they can't question. And then it's presented as a virtue or something, right?
Right.
I'm gonna steal your imagery and I'll let you explain it, as we
Sure.
get to the end of the episode. But
Yeah,
we were
yeah, yeah.
talking off mic ahead of time, like there's two rails to
Mm,
carry the train. And part of it
hmm
is the emotional part, the feeling of love and compassion,
hmm
those emotional mind states. But the other part is like wisdom.
Yeah.
You were just sharing your vision of this earlier, right? And you're writing
Yeah.
about it. I didn't mean to steal your imagery, but
No, you're
it seemed
good.
like a perfect time to drop your imagery into the conversation because it's a two-rail system,
Yeah.
right? And if I just break one of the rails, well, then I can't run a train on it.
You can't run a train on it.
Unless, yeah, that's it. You know, the train won't run.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that has to be, I mean, something for each of us individually. That's a powerful thing to recognize. This is a two rail system.
Yeah.
I need to refine my emotional states to get more feelings of compassion and love and these kinds of things, work on my emotions, right? But
Mm-hmm.
the other part is I have to be able to think critically to develop
Mm-hmm.
wisdom and discernment and
Mm-hmm.
insight. And if
Mm-hmm.
someone tells you we're just going to blow up one of those rails, boom,
Right.
how are you going to get anywhere as an individual? And then what does it mean when all of a sudden you get people who are going to potentially be abusive of
Yes.
your loss of, like what you said very well, your loss of the discernment factor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so yeah, I think we nailed it.
Yeah, I mean, and people forget that they are the conductor of their own train, regardless of whatever religion or practice that they are investing in for some time or for their life. They are still the conductor of their own train, regardless.
Yeah.
And that
By
sense of it,
definition, almost, right? Like
yeah, and
you
yeah,
are the conductor just by definition. It's you.
it's you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always you. And so you can totally take well, if we're going to use it, transit analogies, you could totally get directions from somebody for sure, but you have to put them in your GPS. You have to put them in your vehicle, and then you have to drive there. So ultimately, you're still in control. You're still in control. And if you cede that control at any point and the tracks break, then the train is derailed. The vehicle is derailed. And what do you have now? You only, where are you going now without one of the other one? If you're seeking knowledge only without it being based on compassion, what is that? This eventually is going to yield you power, right? Information is going to yield you power, and you will probably use that power nefariously because you're going to justify your own skewed views,
Or it's
right?
dry, right? It's dry and brittle, right?
It's dry and brittle,
Doesn't
but it's
have the,
justific
yeah,
it's justification for
yeah.
delusions because you're
Mhm.
not based. It can be it can be twisted much very easily. It can be
There's a
twisted.
danger in that for sure, right?
Yes,
And I think we're
yes,
seeing that in our world now, and we'll get to like tech bro Christianity, which is kind of dry and like
yeah,
lacks those loving qualities, right? We'll do
yeah.
it for the end. Yeah.
Then let's do it next week, and we'll just continue on this.
All right. We'll get things to cover, but I agree with what you're saying,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And it ends up being dangerous, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
And then the
So
idea that well, there's the Philip K. Dick line, the empire never ended, right?
right, correct.
Kept rolling on because all we had to do was scramble people's brains and they won't question. We keep running the same story, right? Yeah.
Here
All right,
we
cool,
are.
Daniel. Thanks so much for the
All right,
conversation.
brother. Yeah, thanks so much, Eric. As always, gracias, amigo. People here, everybody listening, seeing us here, like, comment, subscribe. Give us an email, jinnaandtantra@gmail.com. Hit us up on the podcast, Jinn and Tantra Podcast. do all the things that people ask you to do. We're asking you to do it. This is of course a labor of love, and we do enjoy doing this. We're always learning things, and I think things that we find useful and interesting, we weave into this, just like any good tantric practitioner would do. We got our retreat coming up, which we'll leave some information in this, and we'll do a little video on that coming up here soon as well. So wishing everybody good practice and good success in their life at this crazy, crazy time. For Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.